everyone. Today's mini lesson is going to focus on various important Supreme Court cases and looking at the connection to democratic values, which we've been talking about for the last several lessons, as well as looking at how the amount of power and the type of power that the federal government has changed over time, depending on interpretations of the Constitution and Supreme Court case rulings. Today's mini lesson includes two different learning targets that are similar but different. The first one states, I can analyze how influential tort cases express the democratic values and change the Constitution. In that learning target, we're specifically going to focus on looking at how things like justice, liberty, those democratic values that we've talked about in the last several lessons, impact the Supreme Court cases over time. The second one states, I can identify and explain how the Supreme Court decisions and provisions in the Constitution impacted the power of the federal government. In that learning target, we're going to specifically focus on one more of the Supreme Court cases, as well as look at the difference between the term federalism, implied powers, and enumerated powers in terms of the amount of power the federal government has. To begin with, we're going to talk about constitutional powers. The Founding Fathers were very intentional to ensure that in the Constitution there was a separation of power between the three branches of government. They wanted to ensure that they didn't have similar conditions than what they had broken away from under Great Britain. However, they created a document that was largely adaptable over time. Consequently, the interpretation of the Constitution has changed depending on who is in various offices of government and what's going on in the country. The term federalism was first termed when the Founding Fathers were initially discussing the distribution of power between the federal government and the state governments. Under the Articles of Confederation, there had been a very strong emphasis on the states having a majority of the power. However, the Founding Fathers soon discovered that that didn't really work for a government and that you needed to have at least a semi-strong central government in order to ensure that chaos does not obstruct and in order to take care of the day-to-day responsibilities. The term federalism is defined as the division of power between states and the federal government. Within the United States, there are certain responsibilities that goes to the federal government, which are involving national issues, to the most important being national defense, talking about running the military, and international relations, so forming various forms of relations with other countries, including forming treaties and economic agreements. At the state level, within the U.S., the state governments are responsible for local issues. This includes things like education, transportation, and criminal justice. In addition to this division of power between the federal and the state governments, the Constitution has also been interpreted in different ways depending on the implied powers versus the enumerated powers. The implied powers are powers that are not specifically stated in the Constitution but necessary to the function of the government. An example of one of the implied powers that has been largely enforced in different Supreme Court cases as well as in the other branches of government is Article 1, Section 8. Within Article 1, Section 8, they have what has been tagged the elastic clause, which states that the government is able to make laws which are necessary and proper to carry out the duties. So there are some responsibilities that the various branches of government have taken on that were not discussed by the Founding Fathers or not specifically stated in the Constitution. Some examples include interstate commerce. So the federal government is responsible for trade between multiple states, as well as promoting the general welfare. So this is looking at things like looking at first responders and things like that. Enumerated powers are specific powers stated in the Constitution. Over time, these have been far less controversial because they are specifically stated, they were approved by the Founding Fathers, and they have not been adjusted or amended over time. So now we're going to look at two Supreme Court cases that specifically have adjusted the amount of federal government power that they have. The first being Marbury versus Madison. In 1803, they had one of the most influential court cases of all times, which was right at the beginning of the first Supreme Court. What happened was under Thomas Jefferson, under John Adams, I should say, Marbury was hired in order to work for the government. Once Madison took office as the Secretary of Treasury, he did not feel that he had to pay Marbury for his services. While the case itself is very complicated, the most important implication in terms of looking at the Supreme Court case as a whole is that it established this term of judicial review. Under judicial review, it says that the Supreme Court determines the constitutionality of policy and decisions. In this case, they determined that the Supreme Court could not legally make a decision on the case. And so, while they didn't really answer the question of Marbury versus Madison, they did establish one of the most influential concepts in terms of judicial review. Another important one in terms of looking at the amount of power that the federal government has is McCulloch versus Maryland, which happened in 1819. In 1819, the Supreme Court determined that the supremacy of the federal government exists over state governments. So, in other words, if there was a conflict between laws at the federal level and laws at the state level, then they stated that the federal government trumps over the state laws because they are over the entire country instead of an individual state. It also indicated that the federal power wasn't limited to those in the Constitution. So, this is where we start to see the development of the Lasted Clause, sometimes also called the Necessary and Proper Clause, where the federal government starts taking on responsibilities that were not formally stated in the initial Constitution. So now we're going to move on to talking about Supreme Court cases that relate to the various democratic values. One of the most influential court cases of all time is Plessy v. Ferguson, which happened in 1896. So in 1896, they had a case where Plessy, who was partially African American, was sitting on a white portion of a train, and consequently, he got in trouble for doing it. And so it went all the way up to the Supreme Court to determine whether he had the right to do that or not. And what they found was that it established this concept of separate but equal. So, Supreme Court stated that as long as there were equal facilities for different races, that it was okay to keep them separated. However, the reality was it was a long time before there were similar services available for different races, and as long as they were separate, that gap continued to widen. So, Plessy v. Ferguson really relates to this idea of equality in that it takes a step back from equality in making it so that there was a section of the population that was not supported under the resources provided by the government. This goes against both equality and justice. Brown v. Board of Education kind of piggybacks on Plessy v. Ferguson. Notice that it is in 1954, so it is like almost 60 years later, and it specifically addressed racial segregation in the schools. It found that separate but equal doesn't apply to schools, and that segregated schools were not equal. And consequently, within the public school system, they found that the schools had to be integrated, which means that the races needed to be combined. This addresses both the democratic values of equality and justice in schools. Miranda v. Arizona happened in 1966, and it adjusted the rights of individuals in the police custody. It ruled that suspects needed to be notified of their rights, including the right to remain silent. So if you have ever heard the term Miranda rights, which are the rights that the police officers read you as you are getting arrested, that is where this came from. Miranda versus Arizona. So this protects individuals to ensure justice. So this is related both to individual rights and justice. Obergefell and Hodges is a more recent Supreme Court case, and it happened in 2015. It focused on same-sex marriage and ruled at the federal level that the right to marry extended to same-sex couples. This one has been a little bit controversial over time because state governments have different rulings in terms of same-sex marriage. However, this was the first time that the Supreme Court ruled on it on this grand level. So within the lesson, you're going to have the opportunity to pick one to do some more research on and do a choice project on, but this should provide you with a general overview of the impact on the power of the federal government as well as the impact on those democratic values.